Charlie, if you don't get back here right now, I swear I'll... Jake Miller's voice trailed off as he sprinted down his driveway for the fourth night in a row, watching the golden retriever vanish into the darkness. He had never been a dog person before Charlie, but somehow, that stubborn ball of golden fur had wiggled his way into his life and his heart. But now, Charlie was pushing his patience to its limits. Every night at precisely 11:37, the dog would scratch at the back door, whining in that urgent way only dogs could. And every night, if Jake didn't let him out, Charlie would find his own way. The first time, Jake chalked it up to boredom. The second time, he thought maybe Charlie had seen a rabbit or a stray cat. The third time, Jake started getting worried. But now, on the fourth night, there was no denying it. Charlie was running away. But why? Determined to find out, Jake grabbed his jacket and sprinted after him. The chilly autumn air bit at his skin as his sneakers pounded against the pavement. The quiet suburban neighborhood of Greenfield, Ohio, was mostly asleep by now. Porch lights flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the soft, distant padding of Charlie's paws against the ground. He was fast, too fast for a dog that spent most of the day lazing on the couch. Jake's chest burned as he pushed himself harder, but just as he thought he was closing in, Charlie took a sharp turn into a wooded area at the edge of the neighborhood. Jake hesitated. He had lived in Greenfield his whole life, but he had never ventured into the woods at night. Something about it felt off. But Charlie was in there, and there was no way Jake was going home without him. Steeling himself, he plunged forward. The woods swallowed him whole, the streetlights fading into nothingness. The crunch of leaves beneath his feet felt deafening in the quiet. Every shadow felt like it could be something watching him. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, and just as he was about to call out for Charlie, he saw it. A small, flickering light in the distance. Jake slowed down, his heart hammering. The light wasn't moving. It was steady, glowing like a lantern in the darkness. And Charlie was there, sitting perfectly still, his tail wagging slightly. Jake took a few cautious steps forward. That was when he saw her. A woman sat on an old wooden bench, bundled up in a thick coat. Her silver hair glowed in the soft light of the lantern sitting beside her. She looked up at him, startled, and then her eyes softened when she saw Charlie. "Well, looks like you finally caught up," she said, her voice warm but tired. "I was wondering when you'd come." Jake blinked. Who are you? Why is my dog running out here every night?" The woman sighed and patted Charlie's head, scratching behind his ears the way he liked. "Because he knew I needed him." Jake stepped closer, trying to make sense of it. Charlie leaned into the woman's touch, his whole body relaxing. It wasn't fear that had been driving him out here. It was something else. Something deeper. "My name's Evelyn," the woman continued. "I used to live just down the street, until I didn't." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Evelyn gave him a small, sad smile. "I lived in the house on Willow Street for 50 years. Raised my kids there. But when my husband passed, I didn't have anywhere to go. The house got sold, and I ended up here." Jake's stomach twisted. He had driven past that house 1,000 times, the one with the bright blue shutters and the flower boxes in the windows. He had never noticed when the old couple stopped sitting on their porch in the evenings. He had never questioned what happened when the house changed hands. "Charlie found me a few weeks ago," Evelyn said, scratching the dog's chin. "He just showed up one night, sat with me for a while. Then he came back the next night, and the next. I don't know how he knew, but somehow he did." Jake swallowed hard. His dog, his goofy, lazy dog, had been sneaking off to keep an old woman company. He felt something tighten in his chest. You live out here?" he asked hesitantly. Evelyn nodded. "It's not so bad. It's quiet." It was bad. She was alone, in the cold, without a real roof over her head, and somehow Charlie had known before he did. The weight of it pressed down on him. How had he never noticed her before? How had he never thought to ask? Evelyn gave Charlie a final pat before looking up at Jake. "You should take him home now. It's getting late." But Jake shook his head. "No," he said. "Not yet." He sat down beside her, the wooden bench creaking slightly under his weight. The lantern flickered, casting soft shadows across their faces. Charlie curled up between them, letting out a contented sigh. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. And as Jake sat beside Evelyn, he made a quiet promise to himself. This wasn't the end of it. He wasn't going to just go home and pretend like nothing had happened. Charlie had led him here for a reason. And now, he had to figure out what to do next. Jake sat in the quiet of the woods longer than he expected, feeling the weight of what he had just learned pressing down on him. Evelyn didn't belong out here. She wasn't some shadowy figure slipping through town unnoticed. She was a woman who had lived a full life, raised a family, and then lost everything. And Charlie, somehow, had understood that before Jake ever could. He looked down at his golden retriever, who was curled up comfortably at Evelyn's feet. His body relaxed in a way that told Jake he had no intention of leaving anytime soon. Evelyn let out a soft sigh and pulled her coat tighter around her thin frame. "You know, I used to have a dog," she said suddenly. Her voice was gentle, but there was something in it that hinted at memories both treasured and painful. Her name was Daisy. She was a mutt, but she had the softest brown eyes. My husband used to say she could read my mind. She always knew when I needed her. Jake nodded slowly, glancing at Charlie. "That's how he is. I never even wanted a dog, if I'm being honest. But my sister thought I needed something to keep me company, so she surprised me with Charlie. At first, I thought he was more trouble than he was worth. Then, before I knew it, he was my best friend." Evelyn smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. Dogs have a way of doing that. She looked down at Charlie again, running her fingers through his golden fur. "And this one? He's special." Jake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I still don't understand how he found you, or why he keeps coming back." Evelyn chuckled softly. "Oh, I think you do." Jake was silent for a long moment. He wanted to argue, to say he had no idea why his dog would sneak out into the cold every night. But the truth was right in front of him. Charlie had sensed something. Loneliness. Need. Something Jake had been blind to. And now that he was here, seeing Evelyn wrapped up in that too thin coat, her cheeks pink from the cold, he knew there was no going back to the way things were before. "You shouldn't be out here," Jake said finally, his voice quieter now, less of an accusation and more of a statement of fact. Evelyn sighed, but there was no anger in her expression. "I know." She shifted slightly, glancing up at the sky through the canopy of trees. "But sometimes, knowing something and fixing it are two very different things." Jake frowned. "Do you have anywhere to go?" She hesitated, and that told him everything. "I have a son," she admitted after a moment. "We don't talk much anymore. After my husband passed, things got complicated. He wanted me to sell the house, move somewhere smaller. I wasn't ready. And when the bank took it," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Let's just say it didn't end well." Jake clenched his jaw. He couldn't imagine letting his own mother end up in a situation like this. How could someone turn their back like that? "You think he'd take you in?" Jake asked. Evelyn gave a soft, mirthless laugh. "I think he'd rather pretend I don't exist." Jake felt his hands curl into fists in his lap. There was something so fundamentally wrong about that. But what could he do? He had only just found out about this. It wasn't like he had some grand solution lined up. Charlie let out a small whine, nudging Evelyn's hand with his nose. She smiled faintly, rubbing his head. Jake sighed. "Look, I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "But I know one thing. You can't stay out here. It's too cold. And Charlie's going to keep coming back no matter what. So if you don't want me chasing after him every night, I need to figure something out." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering him. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Jake rubbed a hand down his face, thinking. "I don't know yet, but I have a guest room. And if you need a place to stay, at least until we figure out something better, it's there." Evelyn's eyes widened slightly, and she looked at him like she wasn't sure if she had heard him right. "You barely know me." Jake shrugged. "Charlie does, and that's good enough for me." She let out a breath, shaking her head as if she couldn't quite believe it. "That's kind of you, Jake. But I don't want to be a burden." "You won't be." She looked away, her fingers running over Charlie's fur absently. "I appreciate it," she said after a long pause. "But I don't want pity." "It's not pity," Jake said firmly. "It's just the right thing to do." She was quiet again, and for a moment he wondered if he had pushed too hard. Then finally, she let out a long sigh. "All right," she said. "Just for a little while." Jake nodded. Just for a little while. Charlie's tail thumped against the ground, as if he had understood every word. Jake exhaled, pushing himself up to his feet. "Come on, let's get out of here before we both freeze." Evelyn hesitated for only a moment longer before following him. The woods felt different as they walked back. Less cold, less empty. Jake had come out here looking for answers, and he had found something much bigger than he had expected. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was for sure. Charlie had known what he was doing all along. And now, it was up to Jake to figure out where to go from here. The walk back to Jake's house was silent, save for the sound of their footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. The air had turned colder, and Jake noticed the way Evelyn held her coat tighter around herself, shivering slightly. He made a mental note to find her something warmer when they got inside. Charlie trotted happily between them, tail wagging, completely at ease as if he had just solved the world's biggest problem. And maybe, in his own way, he had. As they neared Jake's house, he hesitated. He hadn't really thought about what came next. Offering Evelyn a place to stay had felt like the right thing to do in the moment. But now that they were here, he realized just how unprepared he was. He hadn't had a guest stay over in years, let alone someone who needed real help. His house was tidy enough, but it wasn't exactly set up for visitors. He hadn't even considered things like what she might need beyond just a warm bed. Still, it was better than the alternative. Evelyn sleeping outside in the cold was not an option. Charlie reached the porch first, scratching at the door with an impatient whine. Jake unlocked it and pushed it open, stepping aside to let Evelyn enter first. She paused at the doorway, glancing at him hesitantly before stepping inside. He could tell she felt out of place. She moved slowly, as if she was afraid of touching anything. "Make yourself at home," Jake said, shutting the door behind them. "It's not fancy, but it's warm." Evelyn nodded, her gaze sweeping over the small but cozy living room. The couch was slightly worn but comfortable, a few blankets draped over the back. The walls were lined with bookshelves, mostly filled with books he'd meant to read but never got around to. A framed photo of him and Charlie sat on the coffee table, taken the day his sister had surprised him with the dog. He hadn't been smiling in it. He'd been mid-grumble about the responsibility. But Charlie had his tongue hanging out, completely unaware that he'd just found his forever home. The guest room's this way, Jake said, motioning down the hall. He led Evelyn to a small but clean room, the bed neatly made with fresh sheets. He wasn't sure if she'd need anything else, but at least it was a place to sleep. "This is more than enough," Evelyn said softly. "Thank you, Jake." He shrugged, feeling a little awkward. "It's nothing." She gave him a knowing look. "It's not nothing, but I won't argue." Jake wasn't sure what to say to that, so he just cleared his throat. "I'll find you some warmer clothes, and there's food in the kitchen if you're hungry. Just help yourself to whatever." Evelyn gave him a small smile. "You've already done more than enough." Charlie nosed his way between them, tail wagging, and Jake took that as his cue to step away. "I'll let you settle in." He left the room, exhaling as he ran a hand through his hair. He had no idea what he was doing, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let Evelyn go back to the woods. That much was certain. A few minutes later, Jake rummaged through his closet and found a spare sweatshirt and a thick pair of socks. They weren't fancy, but they were warm. He knocked lightly on Evelyn's door before pushing it open a crack. "Found you some—" She was already asleep. Jake hesitated. She looked smaller, curled up under the blankets, her face relaxed in a way he hadn't seen before. He placed the clothes quietly on the chair by the bed and stepped back, shutting the door softly behind him. Charlie padded up beside him, looking up at him expectantly. "What?" Jake muttered. "You knew this was going to happen, didn't you?" Charlie just wagged his tail and flopped down on the floor. Jake sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. He hadn't planned for any of this, but maybe that didn't matter. Maybe this was just one of those things you figured out as you went. One thing was for sure. He wasn't going to let Evelyn disappear back into the cold. Not now. Not ever. Jake woke up earlier than usual, his mind already racing with thoughts about Evelyn. He wasn't used to having anyone else in the house. Charlie had been his only company for so long that the idea of another person, especially someone in need, felt both strange and oddly important. He stretched, rolled out of bed, and headed for the kitchen, only to find Charlie sitting at the doorway, ears perked up. "You already checked on her, didn't you?" Jake muttered, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Charlie let out a soft huff, tail thumping lightly against the floor. He had probably been watching over Evelyn all night. Jake walked down the hall and knocked lightly on the guest room door. "Evelyn? You awake?" There was a pause before he heard soft footsteps, and the door creaked open. Evelyn stood there, looking tired but more rested than the night before. She had changed into the sweatshirt he had left for her, and she pulled the sleeves down over her hands, her fingers barely peeking out. I made coffee," Jake said, feeling oddly nervous. "And there's food if you're hungry." Evelyn hesitated before nodding. "That sounds nice. Thank you." They made their way to the kitchen in silence, the morning light streaming through the windows, casting a golden glow over the small space. Jake pulled out a chair for her, then poured her a cup of coffee, sliding it across the table. She wrapped her hands around the mug, seeming to savor the warmth more than anything else. "You sleep okay?" Jake asked. Evelyn nodded. "Better than I have in a long time." He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he just nodded, taking a sip of his own coffee. The silence stretched between them. but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he wasn't just going through the motions of his day. He had something, or rather someone, to think about besides himself. After a few minutes, Evelyn glanced at him. "I know this isn't permanent. I want you to know I appreciate it." Jake set his cup down. "I know it's not permanent, but that doesn't mean we have to rush to figure everything out today. One thing at a time, okay?" She nodded, and for the first time, he saw something almost like relief in her expression. Charlie nosed his way between them, resting his head on Evelyn's knee. She chuckled softly and ran her fingers through his fur. "I think he likes having me here." Jake smirked. Charlie's a pretty good judge of character. Evelyn gave him a small smile, and for a moment, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be as complicated as he thought. He didn't have a plan, and he had no idea what the next few days would bring. But one thing was clear. Charlie had brought them together for a reason. And for now, that was enough. The day unfolded slowly, neither of them in a rush to move beyond the quiet peace that had settled into the house. Jake had never been the type to enjoy small talk, but with Evelyn, the silence felt comfortable. She sipped her coffee in thoughtful sips, occasionally glancing toward Charlie as if she were trying to understand the bond he had formed with her. Jake had always believed that Charlie was just a dog, but now, seeing the way he watched over Evelyn, how he seemed to understand things no one else did, he wasn't so sure anymore. Evelyn finally set her mug down. "So what do you do, Jake?" He blinked. It had been a while since anyone had asked him that, and even longer since he felt like his answer mattered. "I work in construction, mostly houses." She nodded. "That's good, honest work." Jake shrugged. "Pays the bills." Evelyn studied him for a moment. "And do you like it?" He hesitated. He wasn't used to being asked personal questions, especially ones that made him think. "It's fine," he said finally. "I like working with my hands." She seemed to accept that answer, nodding thoughtfully. "My husband was a carpenter, built most of the furniture in our house himself. Said he liked knowing the things he made would last longer than he would." Jake looked down at his hands, calloused from years of work. He understood that feeling more than he could say. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around her mug. "It's strange, you know, how life can turn so quickly. One moment, everything is steady, and then suddenly, you're somewhere you never thought you'd be." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He had never lost everything the way she had, but he knew what it was like to feel untethered, to wake up one day and wonder how you ended up where you were. Charlie, sensing the shift in mood, padded over and pressed his head against Evelyn's leg. She smiled faintly, running her fingers through his fur. "Dogs are good at knowing what we need, aren't they?" Jake nodded. "Yeah. Charlie's got a habit of showing up when you least expect it." Evelyn chuckled softly. "Well, I'm grateful he did." They fell into another easy silence. Jake found himself thinking about what would happen next. He had offered Evelyn a place to stay, but that was a temporary solution. She needed something more. Something stable. "Have you thought about what you want to do?" he asked finally. Evelyn's smile faded slightly. "I don't know. It's been a long time since I had options." Jake frowned. "There's gotta be something. Some family, some place." She shook her head. "I don't want to burden anyone." "You're not a burden," Jake said, the words coming out before he had time to think about them. Evelyn looked at him, surprised. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness," Jake replied. "It's just the truth." Evelyn studied him for a long moment before nodding. I suppose I should start figuring things out. Jake hesitated before saying, You don't have to do it alone. Evelyn smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. I appreciate that. Charlie let out a contented sigh and curled up at their feet, as if he knew something neither of them did. And maybe, Jake thought, he did. Jake wasn't sure how long Evelyn would stay. The thought lingered in his mind as he watched her move through his small kitchen, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the counter as if she were getting used to the space. He had never been good at having people around. It was just him and Charlie most of the time. And that was the way he liked it. But something about Evelyn's presence felt right, like she was meant to be here, at least for now. Charlie had certainly decided that she belonged. He barely left her side, always watching, always waiting. Jake had never seen him so attached to anyone outside of himself. It was as if Charlie had made up his mind long before Jake had. Evelyn turned to him, breaking him from his thoughts. Do you always get up this early? Jake shrugged, leaning against the doorway. Force of habit. Work starts early. She nodded thoughtfully. I used to wake up early too. My husband liked to have coffee on the porch before the sun was up. Said it gave him time to think. Jake could see that, the quiet before the world woke up. He had always liked the early mornings for the same reason, though he had never put it into words before. You miss him, Jake said, more statement than question. Evelyn smiled faintly. Every day. But grief is strange. Some days it's like a whisper. Others, it's like a weight you can't shake. Jake nodded, understanding in a way he hadn't expected. Loss was something he was familiar with, even if his own losses were different from hers. She took a sip of her coffee, her gaze distant. I think about what he'd say if he saw me now. I don't think he'd be happy about it. He wouldn't be happy about you being out there alone, Jake said. But I think he'd be glad you're here now. Evelyn studied him, something shifting in her expression. You're a good man, Jake, even if you don't believe it yourself. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Charlie let out a huff from his spot on the floor, as if agreeing. Evelyn chuckled and reached down to scratch behind his ears. He really is something special, isn't he? Yeah, Jake said, watching them. He is. The rest of the morning passed in quiet companionship. Jake went about his usual routine, though he found himself more aware of Evelyn's presence than he expected. She wasn't intrusive. She simply existed in the space, moving with a quiet grace that made it easy to forget that just days ago, she had nowhere to go. It wasn't until the afternoon that the reality of the situation came creeping back. They couldn't ignore the obvious forever. Evelyn needed a plan, and Jake, despite himself, was starting to realize that he didn't want to send her back out into the world without a clear path forward. Do you have anyone you can call? Jake asked finally, as they sat outside on the porch, Charlie sprawled out between them. Evelyn hesitated before shaking her head. Not really. My son. Things didn't end well between us, and I don't want to force myself into his life if I'm not wanted. Jake frowned. It's not about forcing anything. He's your family. He should know where you are. She sighed. It's complicated. He wanted me to move into a care facility when my husband passed. I wasn't ready. We argued, and then we just stopped talking. I don't know if he'd even pick up if I called. Jake considered that. Maybe it's time to find out. Evelyn looked away. And if he doesn't want to hear from me? Then you'll figure something else out, Jake said simply. But at least you'll know. She was silent for a long moment before finally nodding. Maybe you're right. Charlie lifted his head at that moment, ears twitching. Jake followed his gaze down the road, spotting a familiar car pulling up to the curb. His sister, Lauren. "Looks like I have company," Jake muttered. Evelyn gave him a questioning look, but Jake didn't have time to explain before Lauren stepped out of the car and made her way up the porch steps. "Jake," she said, eyeing him before glancing at Evelyn. "I was in the area. Thought I'd stop by." Jake didn't buy that for a second. Lauren never just stopped by. She always had a reason. "This is Evelyn," Jake said, keeping his tone even. "She's staying here for a bit." Lauren raised an eyebrow but didn't comment right away. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Jake sighed, but nodded, standing and following her a few steps away. "Who is she, really?" Lauren asked, keeping her voice low. "She needed help. Charlie found her." Lauren sighed. "Jake, you can't just take in strangers." "She's not a stranger. You barely know her." Jake crossed his arms. "Charlie trusts her. That's good enough for me." Lauren let out a frustrated breath. "You always do this. You take in strays. You fix things that aren't your responsibility." "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But I'm not about to turn my back on her." Lauren looked at him for a long time before shaking her head. "Just be careful, okay?" Jake nodded, watching as she walked back to her car. When he turned back to the porch, Evelyn was watching him, something unreadable in her expression. "She cares about you," Evelyn said quietly. "Yeah," Jake said. "She just doesn't always get it." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I think she does more than you think." Jake didn't respond. Instead, he sat back down next to her, feeling Charlie press up against his side. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let Evelyn go through this alone. Not now. Not ever. Jake wasn't sure why Lauren's visit put him on edge, but it did. Maybe it was the way she looked at Evelyn, like she was a problem he had to solve. Maybe it was the reminder that what he was doing wasn't normal, at least not to most people. But Charlie had found Evelyn, and Jake had decided she wasn't going anywhere just yet. That was all there was to it. Evelyn, for her part, didn't seem too rattled by the interaction. She sipped her coffee, watched the trees sway in the light afternoon breeze, and scratched behind Charlie's ears absent-mindedly. If she had any thoughts about what just happened, she kept them to herself. After Lauren drove off, Jake sat back down on the porch, stretching his legs out in front of him. "You all right?" Evelyn nodded. "Your sister's protective of you." Jake snorted. "That's one way to put it. She just wants to make sure you're okay." He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know. Doesn't mean she always goes about it the right way." Evelyn smiled, but there was something a little sad in her expression. "It's good that she cares." Jake didn't respond right away. He knew Evelyn wasn't just making small talk. She was thinking about her own family, about the son she hadn't spoken to in years. He wasn't sure what to say that wouldn't come across as empty reassurance, so he just sat there with her in the quiet. Charlie, who had been lazing between them, suddenly lifted his head. His ears perked up, his body alert. Jake followed his gaze and saw a man walking down the sidewalk toward the house. He didn't recognize him at first, but as he got closer, Evelyn sucked in a sharp breath. Jake turned to her. "You know him?" She nodded slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of her coffee cup. "That's my son." Jake felt his stomach twist. He hadn't expected this. Not so soon. Lauren must have found him, must have called him. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. The man, Evelyn's son, reached the base of the steps, but didn't come any closer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked to be in his late 30s. His face was tight, his expression unreadable. "Mom," he said finally. Evelyn set her cup down and stood, hesitating before she spoke. "Michael." There was a long, heavy pause. Jake stood too, unsure whether he should give them space or stay put. Charlie, seemingly attuned to the tension, sat still, watching them both. Michael exhaled, glancing at Jake before turning his attention back to his mother. "A woman called me. Your friend?" Evelyn nodded. "Lauren." Michael looked uncomfortable. "She said you were here?" "I am." Another pause. Then he rubbed his jaw, sighing. "Mom, why didn't you call me?" Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them in front of her. "I didn't think you wanted to hear from me." Michael frowned. "That's not..." He stopped, shaking his head. "That's not fair. I wanted you safe. I wanted you somewhere where you'd be taken care of." Evelyn smiled faintly. "And I wasn't ready for that." Michael let out a frustrated breath. "So instead, you ended up living on the street? That's better?" Evelyn winced, and Jake felt a flash of irritation. He understood where Michael was coming from, but the way he was talking to his mother wasn't sitting right with him. "She wasn't on the street," Jake said before he could stop himself. "She was surviving." Michael turned to him, his brows furrowed. "And you are?" "Jake, why are you involved in this?" Jake crossed his arms. "Charlie found her. I didn't feel right letting her go back out there alone." Michael studied him, something unreadable in his expression. Then, he turned back to his mother. "You should have told me where you were." Evelyn sighed. "I didn't want to be a problem for you." Michael let out a quiet, almost bitter laugh. "You're my mother. You were never a problem." Evelyn looked down, and for a moment Jake thought she might cry, but she just nodded. "I wasn't sure you'd feel that way." Michael ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't know what to think. I tried calling. You never answered." Evelyn glanced away. "I was ashamed." Jake saw Michael's expression soften just slightly. "Mom," he said, quieter now. "You don't have to be ashamed." Evelyn shook her head. I didn't know where to go. And by the time I did, I felt like it was too late to reach out." Michael took a deep breath. "It's not too late now." Evelyn hesitated, glancing at Jake. He gave her a small nod. This wasn't his call to make. This was between them. Michael shoved his hands into his pockets. "Look, I don't know how we fix everything, but if you want to, I'd like to try." Evelyn's breath hitched slightly, and for the first time since he had met her, Jake saw hope in her eyes. She nodded. "I'd like that too." Michael nodded once, exhaling. "All right." He looked at Jake again. "Thanks for looking out for her." Jake nodded back. "She's easy to look out for." Michael smirked slightly, then turned back to his mother. "I don't want to rush you, but when you're ready, you can come home." Evelyn's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected that. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Okay." Michael gave her one more look before stepping back toward his car. "I'll call you later?" Evelyn smiled. "I'd like that." He nodded once more, then got in his car and drove away. Evelyn sat back down heavily, staring after him. Charlie rested his head on her knee again, and she absently stroked his fur. Jake sat down beside her. "You okay?" he asked. Evelyn let out a slow breath, then nodded. "Yeah." Jake watched her for a moment. "You don't have to rush into anything." She smiled. "I know." They sat there for a long time, watching the sky change colors as the sun started to lower. There was still so much ahead, so many things unresolved. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like there was a path forward. And maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. Jake watched Evelyn carefully over the next few days. She seemed lighter, as if Michael's visit had removed a weight from her shoulders. She wasn't in a hurry to leave, and Jake wasn't in a hurry to send her off. Charlie was just as happy to have her around. He followed her from room to room, wagging his tail whenever she spoke to him or reached down to pat his head. If Charlie could have his way, Evelyn would never leave. Jake wasn't sure how to navigate the situation. He knew it wasn't permanent, that Evelyn would eventually go home to her son. But something about her presence in the house felt right, like it was supposed to happen. He found himself making extra coffee in the mornings, setting out an extra plate at dinner, and even picking up a few things at the store that he thought she might like. It was strange how quickly he had gotten used to having someone else there. Evelyn seemed to settle into the routine easily. She spent her mornings reading on the porch, her afternoons helping Jake with small tasks around the house, and her evenings sharing stories about her life. She didn't talk much about her time on the streets, but when she did, Jake listened carefully, trying to understand what she had been through. She had a quiet strength about her, a resilience that Jake admired even if she didn't see it in herself. One afternoon, while Jake was working on a project in the garage, Evelyn came in carrying a tray of lemonade. Charlie trotted in behind her, his tail wagging happily. Jake looked up from his workbench and smiled. "You didn't have to do that," he said, taking a glass. Evelyn shrugged. "I wanted to. It's the least I can do after all you've done for me." Jake sipped the lemonade, appreciating the tartness. "It's not a big deal." She tilted her head, studying him. "It's more than you think. Most people wouldn't have done what you did." Jake set the glass down and returned to his project. "Most people don't have a dog like Charlie." Evelyn chuckled softly. "No, I suppose they don't." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Jake focusing on the repairs he was making and Evelyn watching, occasionally asking questions. It felt natural, easy. Jake had never been good at small talk, but with Evelyn, he didn't feel the need to fill every silence. She seemed content just to be there, and he was grateful for that. As the days went by, Jake started to wonder what would happen when Evelyn left. He hadn't given it much thought before, but now it nagged at him. He knew she had a son to go back to, a family that wanted her safe, but he also knew that things wouldn't be the same once she was gone. He tried not to dwell on it, but the thought crept in when he wasn't expecting it. One evening, after dinner, Evelyn brought up something that caught Jake off guard. "Jake," she said, her voice tentative, "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I leave." He looked up from his plate, not sure how to respond. "Yeah?" She nodded. "Michael offered to take me in, and I'm grateful for that. But I don't want to rely on him forever. I want to find a way to stand on my own again." Jake set his fork down, trying to read her expression. "What does that mean, exactly?" Evelyn hesitated before answering. "I want to work again. I want to have something that's mine, something that gives me purpose. I don't know what that looks like yet, but it's important to me." Jake thought about that for a moment. He didn't know much about what Evelyn used to do, but he respected her determination. "What kind of work are you thinking about?" "I used to work in a library," she said. "I loved it. Being around books, helping people find what they needed. It gave me a sense of accomplishment. I don't know if I can do that again, but maybe something similar." Jake nodded slowly. "You'd be good at that." Evelyn smiled faintly. "We'll see. It's just a thought for now." He didn't say anything more, but he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness at the idea of her leaving. It was selfish, he knew. She deserved to have her independence, to build a life she was proud of. But he had gotten used to her being around, and the thought of coming home to an empty house again wasn't appealing. Charlie seemed to sense the shift in mood. He walked over to Evelyn and rested his head on her lap, looking up at her with big, soulful eyes. She laughed softly, scratching behind his ears. "You know," she said, looking at Jake, "he's the reason I ended up here. I don't know how he knew to find me, but I'm glad he did." Jake smiled. He's good at that, knowing what people need. Evelyn nodded, her gaze distant. "I've been lucky. For a long time, I didn't think I'd have a second chance. But here I am." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded, feeling the weight of her words. She had been through so much, and now she was looking ahead, trying to figure out what came next. He admired her strength, even if she didn't see it as anything extraordinary. As the evening wore on, they sat in the living room, talking about anything and everything. Evelyn told stories about her husband, about the life they had built together before everything fell apart. Jake shared a few stories of his own, though he didn't have much to say. He had never been married, never had a family of his own. His life had been simple, and for the most part, he had been okay with that. But listening to Evelyn, he realized how much he had been missing. When the night grew late, Evelyn excused herself and went to bed, leaving Jake alone with Charlie. He stared at the empty space she had just vacated, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He was happy for her, for the hope she had found, but he couldn't help feeling a little lost. Charlie sat at his feet, looking up at him as if he understood. Jake reached down and scratched behind Charlie's ears. "What are we gonna do when she's gone, boy?" Charlie tilted his head, his tail wagging gently. Jake sighed. He didn't have an answer. But for now, he was grateful for the time they had. Even if it wouldn't last forever, it was enough. Over the next few days, Jake noticed subtle changes in Evelyn. She seemed to carry herself differently, more upright and assured. She started talking about her plans, her ideas for finding work, and even the kinds of places she might want to live. It was clear she was trying to figure out what her next step would be, and Jake was impressed by her determination. But as proud as he was to see her looking forward, a small part of him wished she would stay a bit longer. Evelyn didn't seem in a rush to leave, though. She was taking her time, making sure she had a clear plan. Jake appreciated that. He had grown accustomed to having her around, and he knew Charlie felt the same. The golden retriever was almost always at Evelyn's side, as if he had claimed her as his second human. The bond between them was undeniable, and it made Jake smile to see how much joy Charlie brought her. One morning, Jake was working on a project in the garage when Evelyn came out to join him. She carried a small notebook and pen, and she had a thoughtful look on her face. "What are you up to?" he asked, as she settled onto a stool nearby. "Just writing down some ideas," she said, tapping the pen against the notebook. "Trying to figure out what I want to do." Jake set down his tools and leaned against the workbench. "Anything in particular?" "I've been thinking about volunteering somewhere," she said. "Maybe at a library or a community center. It's been so long since I've done anything like that, but I think it would be a good way to ease back into things." "That sounds like a great idea," Jake said. "You'd be good at it." Evelyn smiled faintly. "We'll see. It's just an idea for now." Jake nodded, and they lapsed into a comfortable silence. He worked on his project, and Evelyn jotted down notes, occasionally looking up to watch him work. Charlie lay at her feet, snoring softly. The sun streamed through the garage windows, casting a warm glow over the space. It was one of those moments that felt both ordinary and special at the same time. Later that afternoon, Evelyn mentioned that she wanted to take a walk. Jake offered to join her, and they set off together, Charlie trotting happily beside them. They wandered through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, the leaves rustling underfoot. Evelyn pointed out little details Jake had never noticed before. An old stone wall hidden behind some bushes, a row of wildflowers growing along the edge of a fence. She had a way of seeing beauty in the small things, and it made Jake look at the world a little differently. They didn't talk much during the walk, but the silence felt comfortable. It was nice to just be in each other's company, to enjoy the simple act of walking together. Charlie ran ahead, occasionally turning back to make sure they were still following. Evelyn laughed when he found a stick and proudly carried it in his mouth, his tail wagging furiously. When they returned to the house, Evelyn seemed more relaxed. She settled onto the porch swing, sipping a glass of iced tea, while Jake went inside to check on dinner. It felt like a routine, something they had been doing for years instead of just a few weeks. And in that moment, Jake realized how much he would miss having her around when she eventually moved on. As the evening wore on, Evelyn began to open up about her past. She talked about her husband, their life together, and the dreams they had once shared. She spoke of the struggles they faced, the moments of joy, and the heartbreak of losing him. Jake listened intently, offering a supportive presence as she shared her story. It was clear that she still carried the pain of losing her husband, but it was also clear that she was finding a way to move forward. Jake shared a bit about his own life, too. He talked about his work, his family, and the reasons he had chosen to live a quiet, solitary life. He admitted that he had never been one for crowds or big social events, preferring the simplicity of working with his hands and spending time with Charlie. Evelyn listened with genuine interest, and Jake found it surprisingly easy to open up to her. By the time the conversation wound down, the sky had grown dark, and the stars were starting to come out. Evelyn looked up at the sky, a peaceful expression on her face. "It's been a long time since I felt this at ease," she said softly. Jake glanced at her, then up at the stars. "I'm glad you're feeling better." She smiled. "I have you and Charlie to thank for that." Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, feeling a warm sense of satisfaction. It wasn't often that he felt like he was making a difference in someone's life. But with Evelyn, it was clear that his decision to help her had mattered. She was finding her way back to herself, and Jake was grateful to have played a part in that. As the days turned into weeks, Evelyn continued to make progress. She started looking into volunteer opportunities, reaching out to local organizations, and making connections. She even began talking to Michael more frequently, rebuilding the bond they had lost. Jake watched all of this with a mix of pride and sadness. He was happy to see her moving forward, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her departure was approaching. Evelyn seemed to sense this. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, she turned to Jake and said, "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done." "You don't have to," Jake replied. "Charlie found you for a reason. I'm just glad I could help." She smiled. "Still, you've given me more than a place to stay. You've given me hope." Jake looked down at his hands, feeling a bit awkward. "Well, you've given me a lot too. It's been nice having you around." Evelyn reached over and patted his hand. "I'll never forget this." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He wasn't ready for goodbye, not yet. But he knew it was coming. Evelyn was finding her footing, building a new life for herself. And when the time came for her to leave, Jake would have to let her go. Jake found himself caught in a strange rhythm. With Evelyn around, the days seemed to flow more naturally. He would get up early, Charlie by his side, and find her already awake, sipping coffee on the porch. They would talk about small things, how the weather was turning colder, a book she'd been reading, or what Charlie had gotten into the night before. It wasn't earth-shattering conversation, but it filled a space Jake hadn't realized was empty. Evelyn's presence had changed things, even if Jake didn't want to admit it outright. He found himself looking forward to those quiet mornings, to the soft laughter she shared when Charlie did something goofy, and to the way she seemed to notice the little details he overlooked. She had a way of making the ordinary feel special, and Jake knew he was going to miss that when she eventually moved on. Evelyn, for her part, seemed to be doing better every day. She'd taken Jake's advice and reached out to a local community center, where she began volunteering a few afternoons a week. She loved it. When she came back, she would tell Jake stories about the people she met, the projects she was helping with, and the small ways she felt like she was making a difference again. It was clear that this new sense of purpose was giving her a renewed energy, and Jake couldn't help but feel proud of her. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Evelyn turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, "I never expected this. Any of it." Jake glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Being here, meeting you, having Charlie show up and change everything. It's like the universe was looking out for me in some strange way." Jake chuckled softly. "I don't know about the universe, but Charlie's got a pretty good sense of direction." Evelyn smiled, her eyes shining in the fading light. "Well, whatever it was, I'm grateful. You've given me a chance to figure things out again, and that's more than I ever expected." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know how to respond. He'd never been good at expressing his emotions, and hearing Evelyn talk about how much this time had meant to her was both humbling and a little overwhelming. He settled for a simple nod, hoping she understood. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn continued to make progress. She started talking more seriously about finding a place of her own, something small and manageable where she could live independently. She had even started putting together a budget, listing out her expenses and figuring out what she could afford. Jake offered to help, but she insisted on doing most of it herself. She wanted to prove, both to herself and to others, that she could stand on her own 2 feet again. As proud as Jake was of her, the thought of her leaving weighed on him. He had grown used to having her around, to sharing meals, conversations, and quiet evenings. Even Charlie seemed to sense that things were changing. The golden retriever stayed close to Evelyn, following her from room to room as if he didn't want to miss a moment with her. Jake tried to focus on the positives, how far Evelyn had come, how much happier she seemed, but it was hard not to feel a twinge of sadness at the thought of saying goodbye. One afternoon, while Jake was working in the garage, Evelyn appeared in the doorway. She was holding a small, neatly folded piece of paper, her expression a mix of excitement and nervousness. "I got approved," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "For the apartment I applied for. I can move in next week." Jake looked at her, the words sinking in. He felt a rush of conflicting emotions, pride, happiness, and that nagging sense of loss he couldn't quite shake. "That's great," he said finally, setting down his tools. "I'm happy for you." Evelyn smiled, though there was a hint of wistfulness in her eyes. "It's all thanks to you and Charlie. I never would have gotten here without you." Jake shook his head. "You did this on your own. Charlie and I just gave you a place to start." She stepped into the garage, holding out the piece of paper. "This is the lease agreement. I wanted you to see it, to know that this is really happening." Jake took the paper and glanced over it, nodding slowly. "Looks like a good place." "It is," she said. It's small, but it's perfect for me." Jake handed the paper back to her, forcing a smile. "I'm glad you found it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn looked at him, as if she wanted to say more, but she held back. Instead, she tucked the paper back into her pocket and gave him a warm smile. "Thank you, Jake," she said, "for everything." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to say anything more. He watched as she turned and walked back toward the house, Charlie following close behind. When she was out of sight, Jake let out a slow breath, leaning against the workbench. He knew this was the right thing, that Evelyn deserved her independence, but that didn't make it any easier. As the week went on, Evelyn started packing up her things. She didn't have much, just a few clothes, a couple of books, and the small items she had accumulated during her time at Jake's house. Jake helped her as much as she would let him, though she insisted on doing most of it herself. She was determined to prove that she could handle it, that she was ready to move forward. Charlie seemed to sense that something was happening. He stayed close to Evelyn, his tail wagging whenever she spoke to him, his big brown eyes watching her every move. Jake could tell the dog was going to miss her just as much as he would. Finally, the day came when Evelyn's new place was ready. Jake helped load her things into his truck, Charlie hopping in and out of the cab as if he were trying to figure out what was going on. They drove to the small apartment complex on the other side of town, where Evelyn's new home awaited. The apartment was modest but cozy, with a small kitchen, a comfortable living area, and a bedroom that would suit her perfectly. Evelyn walked through it with a smile, her excitement evident. Jake carried in her boxes, setting them down wherever she asked. Charlie sniffed around the new space, his tail wagging as if he approved. Once everything was inside, Evelyn turned to Jake and smiled. "It's perfect." Jake nodded. "I'm glad." She looked around, her expression a mix of joy and nostalgia. "I wouldn't be here without you." "You would have figured it out," Jake said. "You're stronger than you think." Evelyn laughed softly. "Maybe, but I had a lot of help." They stood there for a moment, neither of them sure what to say. Finally, Evelyn reached out and gave Jake a hug, surprising him. He hesitated, then hugged her back, the moment feeling both comforting and bittersweet. "Thank you," she said again, her voice quiet. Jake pulled back and gave her a small smile. "You're welcome." Evelyn knelt down and scratched behind Charlie's ears, her smile widening. "You too, Charlie. You're a good boy." Charlie's tail wagged furiously, and he licked her hand, making her laugh. After a few more moments, Jake stepped back. "I should get going. Let you settle in." Evelyn nodded. "I'll be in touch." "Take care of yourself," Jake said. "You too." As Jake walked back to his truck, Charlie trotted beside him, glancing back at Evelyn one last time. Jake climbed into the cab, starting the engine. He gave Evelyn a final wave before driving off, leaving her to her new home. The drive back felt quiet, even with Charlie sitting next to him. Jake's thoughts wandered, and he couldn't help but think about how much had changed since Charlie first ran away that night. He had never expected any of this, but now he couldn't imagine his life without having met Evelyn. She had reminded him of what it meant to help someone, to care about someone beyond himself. As he pulled into the driveway, Charlie let out a soft whine, his tail wagging as if he knew they were back. Jake smiled faintly, scratching behind Charlie's ears. "Come on, buddy," he said. "Let's see what's next." Charlie barked happily and jumped out of the truck, ready for whatever came next. Jake spent the next few days settling into a quieter rhythm. It was different without Evelyn in the house. He still got up early, still brewed coffee for himself, and still went about his day with Charlie at his side. but it wasn't quite the same. There was a certain stillness that lingered in the rooms where Evelyn used to sit. He hadn't realized how much life she brought to the place until she wasn't there anymore. Charlie seemed to notice the change, too. The golden retriever would occasionally wander into the guest room where Evelyn had stayed, sniffing around and looking expectantly at the empty bed before eventually returning to Jake's side. Jake gave him an extra pat on the head each time, as if to reassure them both that things were okay. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch with Charlie at his feet, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. When Charlie first started running off at night, Jake had been frustrated, confused, and more than a little worried. He'd had no idea what his dog was up to, or why he was so determined to leave the house every night. But now, looking back, it all made a strange kind of sense. Charlie had been trying to tell him something, or maybe he had been leading Jake somewhere he needed to go. Either way, the dog's instincts had been right. If it weren't for Charlie, Jake never would have met Evelyn. He never would have learned her story, or seen how much strength she had, or felt the satisfaction of helping someone find their way again. And even though things were quieter now, Jake wouldn't trade the experience for anything. A few days later, Jake got a phone call. It was Evelyn. "Hi, Jake," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey, Evelyn," he replied, a smile spreading across his face. "How's the new place?" "It's great," she said. "Cozy, like you said. And the neighbors are nice. It feels good to have my own space again." "I'm glad to hear that." There was a pause, and then Evelyn added, "I wanted to thank you again, Jake, for everything. You didn't have to take me in, but you did, and it made all the difference." Jake shifted in his seat, feeling a little uncomfortable with the praise. "It was Charlie who found you. I just went along for the ride." "Well, I'm grateful to both of you," she said, her tone sincere. "I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realize how much that time with you and Charlie helped me find my footing again. I feel stronger now." "That's good to hear," Jake said. "You deserve it." "I've also been volunteering more," Evelyn continued. "At the library, like I talked about. It's been wonderful. I feel like I'm really making a difference." Jake smiled. "I'm not surprised. You've always been good at that." There was another pause, and then Evelyn said, "I was wondering if you'd like to come by sometime. I'd love to show you the new place, and you could bring Charlie. He'd probably enjoy seeing it too." Jake hesitated, not because he didn't want to go, but because the thought of visiting her made him realize just how much he missed having her around. Still, he didn't want to say no. "Sure," he said finally. "Charlie and I would like that." "Great," Evelyn said, sounding genuinely pleased. "Just let me know when. I'll have some coffee ready." "Sounds good," Jake said. "I'll call you soon." When the call ended, Jake sat on the porch for a while, looking out at the quiet street. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about Charlie's nightly adventures, and the unexpected connection they had led to. He thought about how much he had changed, even if it was in small, subtle ways. And for the first time in a while, Jake felt a sense of peace. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew he would figure it out. And with Charlie by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Jake found himself falling into a strange, yet oddly comforting routine. Without Evelyn around, the days felt quieter, and while he missed their conversations and the sense of purpose her presence had brought, he was also discovering something new about himself. He'd never been someone who reflected much on his own life. Work kept him busy, and caring for Charlie had always been enough to fill the gaps. But now, those silent moments held a different weight. He started paying more attention to the little things he'd once overlooked. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees at certain times of day, the sound of Charlie's paws padding across the hardwood floor, the distant hum of traffic when the world outside was still. It wasn't that he was happier or sadder than before. It was just different. Charlie, on the other hand, seemed to bounce back quicker. While he'd occasionally wander into the guest room Evelyn had occupied, sniffing around as if he might find her there, he soon returned to his usual self. Playful, curious, and endlessly loyal. Jake took comfort in that. No matter what else changed, Charlie remained his steadfast companion. One evening, as Jake sat on the porch, Charlie at his feet, he received a call from Evelyn. It was their first real conversation since she'd moved into her new place, and Jake was surprised at how natural it felt. "Hey, Jake," Evelyn said, her voice warm and familiar. "Evelyn," he replied. "How's the new apartment?" "It's nice," she said. "Small, but it's mine. I've been volunteering at the library a few afternoons a week. It feels good to be doing something again." Jake smiled faintly, though she couldn't see it. "I'm glad to hear that. You sound happy." "I am," she said. "And I wanted to thank you again. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you and Charlie." "Charlie found you," Jake said, leaning back in his chair. "He's got a knack for that sort of thing." Evelyn chuckled softly. "Well, I'm glad he did. And I'm glad you took a chance on me." They talked for a while longer, catching up on the small details of their lives. Jake told her about the repairs he'd been working on, about the way the leaves were changing color, about the neighbor's cat that had taken a liking to his front yard. It was all mundane, but it felt good to share it with someone who listened. When they finally hung up, Jake felt a surprising sense of contentment. Evelyn was doing well. She had found her footing again, and that was what mattered most. But it also made him think about his own path. He realized he hadn't thought much about the future, what he wanted, where he was going. For years, his life had been defined by routine. Wake up, work, come home, take care of Charlie. Repeat. Evelyn's presence, brief as it was, had shifted something in him. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he couldn't ignore it. The next morning, Jake decided to take Charlie on a longer walk than usual. They ventured beyond their typical route, exploring a wooded trail Jake hadn't visited in years. The air was crisp, and Charlie bounded ahead, his golden fur gleaming in the sunlight. Jake watched him, smiling at his dog's unbridled enthusiasm. As they walked, Jake found his thoughts drifting to Evelyn's new life. She'd mentioned a community event at the library, something she was helping to organize. It sounded like she was building connections, forming a new community of her own. Jake wondered if he should visit her sometime, maybe see what she'd been working on. The idea made him both nervous and excited. It had been so long since he'd stepped outside his comfort zone, and Evelyn's invitation lingered in the back of his mind. Charlie returned to Jake's side, a stick clamped in his mouth. He looked up at Jake with expectant eyes, tail wagging furiously. Jake laughed and took the stick, tossing it down the trail. Charlie dashed after it, his energy infectious. When they got back home, Jake noticed a small envelope in the mailbox. It was from Evelyn. Inside was a handwritten note and a photograph. The note was short, but it made Jake pause. "Jake, thank you for everything. This is just a small token to remind you that you made a difference. I'll never forget how much you helped me. Charlie, too. Warmly, Evelyn." The photograph was of Evelyn and Charlie on the porch swing, taken on one of those quiet evenings before she'd moved out. They were both looking at the camera, Evelyn smiling softly, Charlie gazing up at her with that unmistakable loyalty in his eyes. Jake stared at the picture for a long time before carefully placing it on the mantel. Over the next few weeks, Jake found himself thinking about Evelyn more often. He'd catch himself looking at the picture on the mantel, remembering their conversations, and the way she brought a sense of warmth and perspective to his life. He wasn't sure what to do with those feelings, but he didn't push them away. Instead, he let them sit, hoping that in time he'd figure out what they meant. Evelyn called again, and this time she mentioned that the library was hosting a book sale. She invited Jake to stop by if he was free. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to step into that world, but eventually he agreed. When Jake and Charlie arrived at the library, the atmosphere was lively. Tables filled with books lined the main hall, and volunteers bustled about, organizing stacks and chatting with visitors. Evelyn was near the entrance, greeting people as they came in. When she saw Jake and Charlie, her face lit up. "You made it," she said, her smile wide. Jake nodded, feeling a little out of place but glad he'd come. Charlie wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Evelyn laughed, kneeling down to greet Charlie. The dog wagged his tail furiously, clearly thrilled to see her. Jake watched as they interacted, feeling a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Evelyn stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. "Come on, I'll show you around." She led Jake through the event, introducing him to some of the other volunteers and pointing out her favorite book sections. Jake found himself relaxing, enjoying the energy and enthusiasm of the people around him. It wasn't the kind of environment he typically sought out, but being there with Evelyn made it feel different. By the end of the day, Jake realized he'd had more fun than he'd expected. Evelyn walked them back to the truck, Charlie trotting happily beside her. When they reached the parking lot, she turned to Jake, her expression warm. "Thanks for coming, Jake. It means a lot." Jake met her gaze and nodded. It was a good day. As he and Charlie drove home, Jake felt a quiet sense of contentment. It wasn't that everything had changed overnight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was more to look forward to. And that was enough for now. Jake drove home that evening with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The visit to the library had been more than just a pleasant distraction. It had given him a glimpse into the new life Evelyn was building for herself. He could see how much the work meant to her, how the small community of volunteers and regular visitors gave her a sense of purpose and belonging. It made him realize that she wasn't just moving on. She was thriving. Charlie lay in the passenger seat, his head resting on his paws, his tail thumping against the seat every so often. Jake reached over and gave him a gentle pat. "Good day, huh, boy?" Charlie wagged his tail again, as if agreeing. Back at the house, Jake settled into his usual routine. He fed Charlie, cleaned up the kitchen, and sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the last light of the day fade into the horizon. The picture of Evelyn and Charlie still sat on the mantel, a quiet reminder of how far they'd all come. Jake looked at it now and then, not with sadness, but with a kind of gratitude. That chapter of his life had been unexpected, but it had left him with something he hadn't realized he was missing. The days that followed were simple, but Jake found himself thinking about Evelyn often. He thought about her determination, her strength, and the way she could find beauty in even the smallest moments. He thought about the changes she'd inspired in him, the way she'd made him see the world a little differently. And he thought about Charlie, whose quiet wisdom had brought them together in the first place. As winter approached, the weather turned colder. Jake started stacking firewood by the porch, preparing for the long nights ahead. Charlie stayed close, watching with interest as Jake worked. It was a quiet life, but it was a good one. One evening, as Jake was settling in with a book, the phone rang. It was Evelyn. "Hey, Jake," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "Evelyn," he replied, a smile spreading across his face. How's everything? Good, she said. Really good. I've been busy at the library, and I've started taking a class at the community college. Something I've always wanted to do. That's great, Jake said, genuinely pleased. What class? Creative writing, she said, a hint of excitement in her voice. I'm not sure what I'll do with it, but it feels good to be learning again. Jake nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Sounds like you're doing exactly what you should be. I think so, she said, her voice thoughtful. And I wanted to say thank you again. For everything. You and Charlie. You changed my life. Jake felt a lump in his throat. You changed mine too, Evelyn. More than you know. They talked a little longer, sharing updates on their lives, before saying their goodbyes. Jake set the phone down and stared out the window, watching as the first few snowflakes of the season drifted down. He thought about how much had changed since Charlie's nightly escapades had first begun. Back then, it had been a mystery, an annoyance, something he didn't understand. But now, he realized it had all been leading to something important. As the snow began to cover the ground, Jake looked over at Charlie, who was stretched out on the rug, completely content. He smiled, feeling a quiet sense of closure. The journey they'd been on together wasn't one he could have predicted, but it was one he would always carry with him. Thanks, boy, Jake said softly. Charlie opened one eye, his tail thumping once, before he drifted back to sleep, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt truly at peace.